Alrighty, so this is going to be the recording for the week one GoToMeeting, and what we're really going to be doing here is just kind of looking over the project requirements. We'll dive into the documentation a little bit, and I think kind of the main thing I want to do is just give like a light overview of RenderMan and just kind of get you kind of comfortable with it, and then hopefully also have some time near the end to start diving into a little bit of the UV mapping. And UV mapping is a little tricky, mainly because it's not really like you had a class on it. It's just one of those things that gets thrown into random classes, almost like Photoshop. Like they might do half a day of UV mapping, and it's just like you're doing it just to get through it so you can kind of get to the fun stuff, like making a texture. But we're going to be diving pretty deep into UV mapping at the end of this week and the beginning of next week. And I'm hoping kind of after you guys go through the project that you really understand what the tools are doing, because there's supposed to be a real workflow for UV mapping. It's not just clicking planar map and the unfold button randomly, crossing your fingers and hoping it all works out. There's a really like a thought process you're going to go through. And if you do it right, you can start breaking down almost any complex shape into much simpler shapes, and we even may get the unfold tool to work, and not break the UV shell. Because the UV tools are way, way better in these newer versions of Maya, especially because it sounds like a lot of you were kind of coming from Maya 2016. And Maya 2016's UV tool set is completely different. Like they revamped this a lot. Excuse me. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's really going to be different because I don't necessarily know the specifics on what they were teaching you, like what tools they were saying to use and don't use. But we're using the newer UV tools kit in Maya 2017 and 18. And I'm going to be kind of showing you how to do much quicker selections and how to basically get these things mapped out super quick. Not getting into this long, tedious process. There's a few shapes that are going to come up where, yes, it does just take a bit. It's just the way it is. But hopefully, kind of after going through this, you're going to feel pretty good about everything. All right. So we'll start off with maybe a little bit of the first week, like with the lighting, and then we'll see if we have some time to get into this guy. So as far as the lighting goes, if you kind of scroll down a little bit, we've got two documentation. Obviously, they relate to the different parts, part 1 and part 2. As far as like which one you should start first, I don't think it matters for this week because the UVs and the lighting don't really affect each other. So if you want, you could totally start with UVing first, but we'll just kind of jump into the lighting. So the docs are pretty good. Our studio artist, Shane Proctor, did a really nice job kind of setting all these up. And it has like the example image. This is essentially your target for this week. It's not really like a tutorial, so it's not going to guide you through like, click this checkbox, move this slider, put in this number and this attribute. That's not really what I want you doing, but it is sort of a broad overview of the different things you will probably need to use. So like, not moving any of the objects, mentioning that the objects use the 3 key. And you probably already know about that, like, hitting 3 on a mesh and it kind of smooths out and becomes subdivided. So they use the 3 key, just something to be aware of, just in case you accidentally take something out of the 3 key at some point. They're already using a material, which is, it's in the hypershade. It's called neutral gray. It's a Pixar surface material, but don't worry about adjusting it. We're not even going to talk about what the materials are doing yet, and that's something we're going to get to in week 3. But the light sources are broken down into 3 different sections. We've got a key light, which is a Pixar rectangular light. So kind of doing the main intensity here. Very, very pale kind of blue white. It's using a cookie filter, which we'll also talk about. We have a fill light, also a Pixar rectangular light. So very, very similar to probably the Maya and Mental Ray area lights you've used before, but they work better. That's using something called an IES profile, which we will probably get to. And we also have the dome lights. And the dome light is the exact same thing as the IBL, the image-based lighting that you've done previously. And again, it's kind of works exactly the same way. And aside from that, like, what the lights are, what you don't want to touch, it's really just match the reference, move the lights around, match intensity, just get it really as close as you can. And then you're going to bump up a couple samples to clean up some of the artifacts, maybe if there's grain, and then you save out that render from the image tool. And that is part one. So obviously the first step for this thing is to make sure that we have RenderMan even installed. And most students kind of coming to me do not have it installed, which is totally fine. So if you do not have RenderMan on your laptop or your desktop, no worries. Just go into the welcome letter and kind of scroll through this guy. And you got the link for the Autodesk account, just getting Maya updated. Really anything 2017 update 4 or later is totally fine. So if you're doing update 5, Maya 2018, it's all good. It's perfect. And then the RenderMan's a little more involved. You have to kind of click through this little documentation that we put together. But if you kind of follow the steps, like registering on the forum, verifying you're not a toddler, you're old enough to install software. Once you kind of go through all that, it's a pretty straightforward process. The nuke one I'm not too worried about yet. We'll come back to that. I would almost maybe hold off on that guy until you get to like week 3 and then maybe start looking into nuke, just because it seems like a few students haven't got that official full sale email with like the license yet. They either send it at the beginning of the program for some people, and there's a giant chunk of students that don't get the nuke license until like a week before you get to the first compositing class, which is right after this class. So you may get the full email and license anyway later in the month, but I would just kind of hold off on this just in case you don't get it. So since you're using a trial, like this kind of worst case scenario, if you're using a trial, since it only lasts like 30 days, it might be good just to hold off a little bit. That way it doesn't like unfortunately, unvalidate and break before the class is over. Because we have that April break this month, and that kind of messes with the schedule a little bit. Break is actually next week. And I have to fix the due dates because I don't think those are even set up properly at this point. So for anyone watching this video later, we're talking about April, there's a spring break, and there's a week off. But I have to fix the due dates. So what I'll probably do is I'm going to open up week 2 so it does start on Monday, but it won't be due that week. It's actually going to be pushed out, so it's almost like 2 weeks total to do the week 2 project. So I might be kind of hit and miss over the spring break, so I might not be available a whole lot because obviously, the school's not really going to be doing a whole lot. But if you have any questions, you can still reach out to Shane Proctor. He'll be on campus. And even if you do shoot me an email later in the week, I can still get to that at some point at the beginning of the next week. But yeah, small break, and then week 2 is actually going to start 2 weeks from now. Okay, so, oh yeah, and if you guys haven't joined Discord, join Discord. We're on there quite a bit, so if Shane and I are on campus, we kind of like to be logged into Discord, and we have like extra challenges we post up there. We share videos and other artists' work that we kind of find might be inspirational. And it's kind of cool too because it's not just for the current students and the instructors. We've got other students that have already gone through the class that still pop in quite frequently. We have graduates, and we have a few people that are working in the industry. We have a couple guys up at MPC in Canada, a motion picture company. They still pop in quite a bit. And there's another guy, Aaron, that is working over at Double Negative, and he still pops into our Discord channel. So be kind of cool if you even talk to some of those guys. They may give you some critiques or advice as you're working on a few of the projects. So it's a nice little meeting ground for everybody. Okay, so let's go back to the week 1 project. Hop in here to competency. So again, go to the documentation. There's some videos here. A lot of these aren't done by me. This is another artist that just kind of put out a bunch of cool videos. Now, some of these aren't even used this week, like the mesh light. We're not doing mesh lights. We're not doing the Pixar Environment Day setup. But I still think it's kind of nice to see this stuff. So feel free to check out a few of those at your own leisure. Even if you're not using this week, still some cool stuff in there you may want to use in your future projects. Now down here, this is the actual project you want to download. This is a full Maya project set. So you are going to be setting to that and building on that every week. This guy is going to have the reference images. So this is going to have the render right here in it that you're going to compare to. And it also has my example of the UVs. So there, and it's going to be like this kind of every week. You'll see a zip file, you download it, it has the examples of what the project could look like if you do it right. And you can see down here what you're submitting. So all that stuff is kind of the same like every other class. Follow the naming convention, put the right file format in there, just kind of pay attention to it, because this does get mixed up quite a bit, where we have people submitting, the wrong file format, or the resolution got changed by mistake. A lot of people submit full Maya projects, like scenes, source images. Please don't submit that. It makes the download massive. So it's really just the one Maya scene. And I can typically troubleshoot that without all the other stuff that goes with it. Okay, so let's do some stuff. Let me make sure I got this project set up for the GoToMeeting. I think, yeah, that should be it. All right. So in my other videos, I have a couple of campus lectures recorded, and usually when I do this, I'm kind of recording a slightly different scene. But for the GoToMeetings, I kind of like to work more on the actual project you're doing. So I'm going to set my project to the same one you're going to use. We're going to go into scenes. I have one Maya file. We're just going to open that up. Now the project's set, hit continue. And this is what you're going to see when you get in here for the first time. So there's not a whole lot in here at the moment. Got a bunch of objects. Pretty much everything should be zeroed out. Yep, I think everything's frozen. Everything should have the pivot centered. So you really don't need to move anything. The camera also is in the right spot. It's locked down, so don't unlock it. You don't need to make a new camera. Now, we're going to be rendering from this guy, so if you end up looking through the render cam and you kind of turn on the resolution gate, you can sort of see generally what the shot's going to look like, but all these guys right here are going to be different materials and things we're building over the course of the month. But because this is one sort of continuous project, it does make sense to start with the lighting first and then start adding all those other elements in there after the lights are done. So I'm going to kind of leave it in perspective. I don't really need to look through this camera, but that is the one we're going to be rendering from. So the RenderMan plugin is already enabled, and that's something you'll kind of get set up after you get it installed, but it's very, very similar to Metal Ray, and I'm sure you kind of remember that song and dance of the Metal Ray plugin disconnecting once a week, and then you kind of go in here and you're like, okay, where's that Maya to MR bundle? You turn it on, it auto-loaded. That kind of turns the Metal Ray plugin back on again. RenderMan does the same thing. It's a little weird. You'll see it does disconnect occasionally. And you can go in the plugin manager to do it. Nothing wrong with that. But one thing that's kind of cool that I completely missed the first few months I was teaching the class, there's a button on the shelf for RenderMan right here that has a plug. And I didn't even realize this, but if you hit that button, that is a shortcut for going into the plugin manager and turning it on there. So if it ever does disconnect and you go in the render settings and it's acting like RenderMan's not even here, just simply hit that guy right there and it'll probably work. But if you do have any issues, of course, reach out to one of us and we'll try to figure out what's going on. One kind of really nice thing about this as well is that you can just tell by looking at the shelf how nice and organized this thing is. We have some render buttons, for kicking off the render. They have these really cool little beautiful icons for the lights. You can right click on any of them with the little arrow in the corner. You can see they have subtools. So that's all nice and organized. We're not going to use any of these old crappy Maya lights. They're pretty terrible. And there's like filters, a lot of stuff we're not going to use. We've also got, let me see here, what else is cool? Light lister is kind of interesting. This will show you all the lights in your scene in like a giant list, so you can kind of turn things off and like change intensity really quickly on multiple lights without like clicking on them individually. So I might come back to this later once we get a few things set up. We have the preset browser. A lot of students really dig this because they love presets. But if you go in the preset browser, these are all different materials that just come with RenderMan. And they're constantly adding stuff to it. So you may see this actually kind of gets bigger and changes, as you continue to use RenderMan and update it. And what else? Oh, if you go onto RenderMan's site, a lot of stuff is set up for free, like in their community area. I believe you can download a bunch of extra ones that just other people have made and just bring them in here and use them, later on for other projects. So that's a whole other discussion, like loading other materials in here and like where to put them. But you can customize this and add stuff to it if you end up finding some more presets you like. But the big one I wanted to show you that I wish more people would click on is that guy right there. Because one thing that anyone who's used Metal Ray remembers is if you had a problem with anything and you do the right thing by going in Google, because they always tell you just go to Google, do a search. When you're looking for things with Metal Ray, you'll find something, but it's usually some crazy old article on CG Society from like 2007. And you're like, this doesn't feel good. It's 2017, 2018. Why are we looking at projects 10 years old? Because Metal Ray was really phasing out quite a bit for quite a few years. But this guy, if you click on it, you don't necessarily have to go to Google immediately. Because if you go in the RenderMan docs and click on the RenderMan section on the side, if you know what it is you have a problem with, like let's say you don't know what a particular material property is doing. Okay, so shading. All right, what material is it? And this will make more sense in week 3 when we do materials, but Pixar surface materials, you're probably going to use the Pixar surface. That's one of the big ones. Click on it, and you're going to get a ton of information. This one was also used in Cars 3. Looks super nice. But this thing can do almost everything you can think of, like skin, plastics, metallic effects, car paint, wood, organic properties. It can really do everything, and they will break down every single attribute in here. And some of these are kind of cool. I don't think it's in this one, but a few of these help doc pages have animated GIFs, so you can actually see them changing something and it like animating across the image. Like what does it look like when a light moves, or if you were to keyframe a shadow, like how does that change something? But I'm not going to scroll through all this and explain it, but it's like a ton of information. So if you're ever bored, feel free to go through here. And it's kind of cool too because we have a guy that works over there at RenderMan. His name's David Hackett, and he works with the school quite a bit. So we also have some inside knowledge on the company and kind of their software, and he's constantly like giving us extra information and customizing all this stuff based on problems and things that come up with students. So your feedback and experience with RenderMan could dictate their future. It's great stuff, though. Yeah, lots of good stuff in there. So anyway, after all that, and those are all things you can kind of check out and play around with, let's try making a few lights. So in the documentation, it was saying that we wanted to make a Pixar rectangular light. And I'm not going to render anything yet, but we'll do like the key light. Okay, so if I right-click on the first one right here, this little light icon, right-click, you can see, well, there's the light source that was listed in the documentation, Pixar rectangular light. So I'm going to hit it, and it may not look like anything appeared, But if you're looking in the outliner, you can see there is something here, like in a list, like there's a node, hit W, and you can tell, oh, it's like everything, it's at the origin. So we're just going to pull that out. We'll scale it up a little bit. And you'll notice kind of immediately that this already looks really, really similar to the, the Maya and mental ray area light. It's a rectangular shape, has a little arrow pointing out of it, showing you the direction it's aiming. So if you kind of feel pretty good about the way those lights worked before, you already kind of know how this one works, but with less headache and less weird things you have to turn on. Like this just kind of works without doing anything to it. But back on the reference, you can kind of see how it looks like that main light source is coming from the left. And if you look at the shadows, like one really important one here is that pulley. Notice how the pulley shadow is like casting almost directly to the right. Scraper blade does it. They all are sort of casting that way to the right. Now there are a couple other shadows like here that look like they're going the other direction, but that is from the second light. But the main light is from the left, casting to the right. Now, even if we maybe we don't know exactly the distance or where it's positioned, but I know it's going to be somewhere like over here, just so the pulley shadow cast across. So let's just kind of give a guess. You like how I'm saying guess, by the way? Like I didn't build this project. I know where the light sits exactly. That ruins the mystery. I guess maybe we'll put it here somewhere. And I can rotate it. Let me go bring up the properties on that again. Let's do a -90. So I'm just kind of aiming like directly down the side. So something like that. And maybe we don't know if it has to be like turned a little bit quite yet, but we'll just kind of leave it here. I'll scale it up a little bit. Again, I don't really understand like the distance quite yet. So anywhere generally in this area is probably like a totally fine starting point. I think the main thing we want to do is get a render kicked off so we can see it, and then from there we can start critiquing, does it feel like the shadows are too soft? Is it too intense? What does the distance, from the objects do to the render? So we're going to kind of minimize all this stuff out of the way, and we're going to kick off our first RenderMan render, an exciting moment. Now, the RenderMan renderer uses its own window. It's called the image tool, and this is going to be super confusing, especially when you hear me talk about it in the video, because the image tool is called it, which means when I say open it, I'm actually meaning image tool, not it in like a general sense. Like it is image tool. They really need to come up with a better name for that. But the image tool button, if you just open it up, this is going to launch a separate little app kind of outside of Maya. And it's still connected to Maya, so whatever we do in here is going to update. But this is almost like you opening the render window like separately. Like it opens it, but this isn't really where you start the render. This is just where you see it. So if I want to start a render, you could open that up first, but really the main thing is using one of these two buttons on the left. That is render current frame and IPR. And IPR is really the big one. You're probably going to be using IPR for like 95, to 99% of the renders you do the entire class. Because the IPR is going to update. So as you start like moving the light, changing intensity, tweaking the color, changing the materials, reflection, that you should see it all update in the IPR almost in real time and immediately show you what it's doing, instead of you hitting re-render over and over again every time you change one slider, which is super annoying. All right, after all that, let's do a render. So I'm going to right-click on IPR. I can pick the camera. Little note here, by the way, on this one, you can't pick the camera. So if you eventually use this one for your final image, this is typically your final shot. This is like a test render. For this one to work, you need to be looking through the camera for that to use the right information. The IPR doesn't care. You can look through perspective and still do this. They might change that in future versions, but for right now, it's this you can pick the camera, that you can't. So we're going to pick render cam. So at the bottom, I was kind of talking to my campus students about this earlier. We see this wonderful little red bar with an error. And I know every time we see this, we panic, like, oh no, something has broke. What could be wrong this time? Don't worry about this. Nothing is really broken. It's totally fine. This is a weird error that just happens with Maya. It's something to do with Maya's render view fighting with RenderMan, but this will not break anything. Like every student, even the staff, all see this. RenderMan's aware of it, but it's not going to ruin the project. So just pretend like this doesn't exist because it really doesn't matter. Now it is rendering, and you can see how it's kind of like sort of wiping through this. It's called samples. Every little wipe of those samples is adding more and more detail. Now that's fine, and it is rendering the image. But you'll notice how mine looks kind of slow, and it's obviously really dark. One thing to kind of keep a note here, or keep in the back of your head, is it looks kind of slow right now for me because I'm running a GoToMeeting and I'm also doing a screen recording. Typically, when you just render by yourself and you're not doing a bunch of other crazy stuff at the same time, it's going to be at least 3 times as fast as this. Like this is very, very slow just because of the GoToMeeting and the recording. So anyway, back to this. Pretty dark. So how do we fix it? If you go to the light and we just kind of load up the attributes here, load that up, load up the attributes, and you can see we have some super simple properties over here: intensity, exposure, color, saturation, and there might be a couple terms you're not familiar with. Like I don't really know what exposure does, but you know, you can, if you move it around, you'll quickly kind of understand what it's doing. So like, and everyone knows intensity, like make something brighter. So if I were to go into intensity and say like, maybe take it to a 10, and just give it a second, and see how it immediately changes? It'll update again way faster for you when you're doing it. It's just slow for me because of the recording. But it'll update immediately. It works for everything. You want to make it a different color, go in there, turn it purple, it'll change to purple. There are going to be a few little like kind of caveats and things that pop up where it clearly doesn't update. Like if you add a new piece of geometry, you add a new texture to something. So a few small things will pop up where it doesn't update. But if you ever feel like the IPR isn't updating, it's really not a big deal. Just hit escape or hit that little cancel render button, right click, redo it, and see if it works. So there are a few times where you will restart it from scratch, but that's just a pretty typical thing with a renderer. But for the most part, it does update. Hey, Adrian. We now have 2 people. Amazing. Welcome to the GoToMeeting. We haven't really got too far. We've just been kind of talking about the basic project overview, and I'm sort of going over the first part of the activity, which is just the lighting. And we'll probably get to a little bit of UV mapping in about probably 20, 30 minutes or so. A couple things about the image tool, or it. When you first open this thing up, you're going to notice a couple problems. So when you click back in Maya, because you can see how this is like a different floating window, what you're going to see is when you click back in Maya to change a setting, it disappears. So by default, in the current version of RenderMan, at least mine, it will disappear constantly. And so if you have a dual monitor, you know, like a second screen, it's not a big deal because it's kind of sitting off on the second screen anyway. But if you're using like just your laptop, that can get extremely annoying. The way to fix it is in the image tool, go to Window, hit Window always on top, which is also the T key. As soon as you hit T, that makes sure that the window always appears over whatever else you've got. And you can obviously turn that on and off as needed. A couple other things too with the image tool. There's a lot of things you can kind of like reveal or hide. I'm not going to really cover all these in huge detail, and a lot of these will just kind of make sense when you just look at it. But the few big ones I do want you to have, one is the image tools. This is going to give you this bar at the top. So image tools is going to be where you use certain tools like in the renderer, like cropping an image. So if I wanted to render a section, I could use the crop tool. There's a thing where I can select objects in the screen. So like if I have that turned on, let me see if it works. Sometimes it doesn't do it. Yeah, see how I'm clicking on the objects in the viewer and it's selecting it over there in the viewport. So that's just using that little selection thing. That's kind of slick. There's some wipes and all that stuff, but you probably will want to have these visible. The catalog's another big one. So the catalog's pretty slick because, and again, it's one of those things where I didn't realize how crappy the Maya version was until I got in here. But remember how with the render view, how every time you wanted to keep an image to compare, you had to hit that stupid little keep image button, and you're like sliding through the slider at the bottom of the image of the render view. And it's super dopey. It was not very good. This, like with the catalog, every time you hit render and make a new render, it automatically stores it in a list. So by the time you're through with the project for lighting, this will probably be pretty big. Like you might have a dozen, 24 different images in here. You can click through them, and each one of them will give you information on like render time, how long did it take, how long ago did you do it, resolution, the samples being used. It just kind of has a lot of nice information that might be useful for troubleshooting. So I do like that. It stores everything automatically. Now this thing at the bottom, this is my pixel readout. Probably not too important for you guys, but you can kind of see when I move my mouse over different parts of the frame, how all these numbers are changing. So it's showing me like the pixel number. So up here is pixel 00, which you can kind of see down there. Those are pixel numbers. And these other guys here, those are the RGB values, which are really, really dark because I haven't bumped the white up very much. What else am I forgetting? Oh, big one too, this is pretty awesome. So the inspector, which I don't usually have open. Let me see if I can get that in there again. Let's see here. Should snap into place. There we go. Okay. With the inspector, all these can be moved around, by the way. You can disconnect any part of this and put it into a new spot. But this guy is kind of cool because previously I'm sure you've had something like shading and lighting where you guys maybe did like a ton of renders back to back, and you're just changing small things like bumping up the quality, changing a ray depth on something, or turning on Final Gather. You know, a lot of things you do, and if you're like me, you'd have like a little notepad, and you're just writing things down like, okay, render 1, put the quality to 2, you write down the render time, then you'll like do another render, like, okay, this is render 3, the render time is this much worse, here's the number I used in quality. And I used to have these notepads just filled with just random, garble and notes of all these little images I've kicked off. But this guy right here is slick because you can actually type in this inspector, which gives you the same information when you hover over it. See how that's the same thing? But because you can type in here, you could leave notes. You can say, okay, this is my key light test 1, maybe intensity of 10. Like you just, whatever, that's fine. And what I could do is if I do another render, I'll do the exact same thing. And again, ignore the error, doesn't matter. It'll start a new line, okay, and see how the notes are different. And I can go in here, and maybe on this one, this is the one where I'm going to change the intensity to, 100, which is going to look terrible. No, actually, it's not that bad. But I can turn it to 100, and it's a lot brighter, and I can write that in the notes. And now, just by clicking between them, you basically have like a running log of everything you've done that particular day. Now, if you close out of the image tool, it will lose all this. But I believe if you do save session, it'll save all your images and all the notes that you had with them. So it's almost like keeping a log of everything you did that particular evening. Pretty cool, though. I think I missed a question earlier here. Yeah, and when you do the final render, because really the IPR is just going to be for like your test images. Uh, those will go by pretty quick. Now it will get a little slower when you get to something like glass, but the final render when you use the render current frame, that one will take a little bit. Like I'm gonna say for the lighting for week one, yeah, like I think 5 to 7 minutes probably sounds about right. Uh, when you start getting through the materials like glass and metal and bump and normal maps, I think it seems like probably the worst I've seen so far for students is it maybe taking like maybe 45 minutes for a final, but that's really pushing it. I think the kind of the average for like the end of the month is most students are dealing with like maybe 10 or 15 minutes for a frame, which is very, very reasonable. Just wait till you guys get to your portfolio classes. Like you're going to see that render time skyrocket with much more complicated projects. So as long as you just kind of allocate enough time and plan for getting the final render kicked off with like at least an hour buffer, I mean you're going to be fine. You'll be surprised how quickly these go by. Okay, so let's hit escape. Okay, I think that kind of covered everything so far with this guy. Do you have any questions about the image tool at this point? Just kind of how it works? I know it'll probably make more sense once you get in there and start messing with it. All right, cool. So maybe I'll just get rid of these for now. You can select them, hit delete. All right. So let's see here. I got that. So back to the light. I'm going to reset this intensity back to 1. And I'm going to show you a couple small things we're going to do to make this a little easier to match the reference. So let me start a brand new IPR render. Oh, one thing, by the way, let me load this up while the render kind of gets going. In the render settings, I know earlier, a second ago, you were talking about like the sample quality and like how long the renders are going to take. So when you go in Render Band Sampling tab in the render settings, just kind of make a note that there are 2 different areas. So I have these min-max samples. This is very, very similar to that quality slider you're doing with Metal Ray, like the overall quality. This tells you the physical number of samples in a pixel, which is a little different because the Metal Ray quality slider was just this arbitrary, 0 to whatever you want to put it to, which didn't make a whole lot of sense. So these guys right here, whether you use 128, 256, they only work with that render current frame button, which is the final render. This one is the IPR. And see how it has its own number, which is half of that guy? And this pixel variance is different. I'm not going to explain that one a whole lot. But basically the pixel variance is sort of determining how many of those samples does it use. Because not every pixel needs 128 samples to calculate. Just like this doesn't need 64. It might stop at 32 if it's a pretty simple project. But the main thing here is that the IPR uses less. It's going to look grainier, but this also means it's going to be faster. So faster, quicker results, better quality for the final render, even though it will take a little bit longer. But I really like that you don't have to constantly change it back and forth to get this to work. You can basically just leave them set up like this at default and ride that out almost through the entire month. And you may not even bump that up at all for the whole class. So these default settings are pretty solid. Okay. Back to this guy. So I think the IPR is still running. Yeah, it's not showing up. So one thing we can do here with the light is instead of just relying on intensity, which is fine, I actually like to use exposure. I typically use intensity for like an on or off slider, like 0, the light's off, 1, it's on. Exposure is kind of cool because it does the same thing as intensity, but every time you go up 1 number with exposure, like going from 0 to 1, you are basically doubling that number. So 0 to 1 would mean that is set to 2. If I go to 2 on this, that's now the same as being 4. 3 is 8. So it's basically just doubling the number, like 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. But because it doubles the previous result, it means you can get to the right intensity way, way faster than you just guessing and typing in random numbers in here until it works. Because sometimes you'll go into intensity and it's like, okay, today I guess we're putting the intensity to 100,000. But this other light next to it uses an intensity of 2. Why? We'll never know. So let's try it out. I'm going to go to an exposure of 1. Okay, this should update. Yep, so even that has brought some illumination here. Let's go to 2, double it. 3 is going to double it again. I'll make a bigger jump. Let's go to 6. Now, even around 6, like, this is not bad, right? Like, that seems okay. I have that little shadow casting to the side. I don't have the reference in here, so I guess we should probably do that. But I'm kind of getting some similar effects. My shadow's casting a lot farther than theirs, so I probably have an issue with like the height or the scale of the light. So maybe my light isn't high enough to wrap over the top of this guy. But let me get the reference in here real quick. That'd be kind of nice. So I'm going to, in the image tool, we're going to do File, Open File. And there we go. That's my campus. Actually, this is the same thing, but let's go to online. This is going to be that zip file you guys are downloading, and there's the lighting reference. Hit open, and you'll see it appears over here, and I can just kind of move that above it. So I usually keep mine near the top. If I can get it there. Oh, not in that guy. Come on. Oh my goodness. There we go. So now I can kind of click back and forth and see where we're at. So I have a few shadow issues, but you can kind of see even with the scraper blade, like that's not looking too bad. Okay. Now, a few things you're going to do here with the light is turn on temperature. Okay, so this is going to be a little different. This is, instead of you guys picking color, this is using real physical numbers. This is using the Kelvin color temperature chart. So you've probably seen this thing before. I don't know if you guys can hear this, by the way, in the background. Like, my cat is going bananas. I know. It's a different cat this time. I have 2 cats, and I have one that's usually screaming every GoToMeeting, and now I've got the sweet one that's usually quiet, just going bonkers over here, running laps, screaming. God, I didn't even use catnip yet. But this chart that you've probably seen before in like high school or like one of your science classes, this chart of kelvins is a measurement for when you have a black body radiator, meaning kind of like an object that produces enough energy will illuminate and cast light waves out from it, kind of like how the filament of a light bulb works, or fire, the sun. If it has enough energy, it will produce a certain wave or a certain wavelengths of color. But this is all kind of shown to us in this kind of cool little color temperature chart. But the main thing to kind of get from this is higher numbers are cooler, lower numbers are going to be warmer, and right in the middle you kind of get some neutral sort of whites. And there's a lot more that goes into it. Like, you can look up our sun, get the actual number. You can look up specific light bulbs. Go to like a light bulb on like Amazon.com. It'll tell you what the color temperature number is. You can put it in the light, and it will illuminate the same color as the light bulb. But if you just kind of watch what happens here, if I turn on temperature, and let's say we go up to like 8,000, which is kind of closer to like sky colors, you should see we get a lot cooler. Yeah, we're starting to introduce like blue into the shot. And what you're going to do is look at the reference. Don't move the color slider up here. Leave that white, because it's almost like mixing paint. Usually you pick, are you going to do this artistically and just pick your color, or do you want to use temperature? It's usually one or the other, not both. So leave that to white if you know you're going to use this. But if, let's say, you overshoot it, okay, like that's pretty blue. What does the reference look like? Not that blue. So maybe I go over here and then knock it down. Like if I go to like 6,500, kind of load it back up, just give it a second. That killed a lot of the blue. And now I've probably overshot it and I went too far the other direction. So it's a little bit of like a dance back and forth where, you'll kind of get it down to till it's really, really close. But just going to do your best. You will probably get this number almost exactly. It's not an extremely difficult number to figure out. But I'm not going to go much farther than that, or I'll end up giving you guys the answer. So let's say we think that looks pretty good. Okay, like I'm kind of okay with that. Maybe it's not bright enough at this point, but I could always go back to the light and say, maybe exposure is 7. This might get too bright. But I could always do like 6.5. Okay, so maybe something like that. But I kind of feel pretty good about that so far. Now the position of the light, if I start moving it around, obviously will affect kind of the way the shadows look. Like it'll change shadow angle. Oh, there's one big thing I forgot to show you. Shoot, I should have done this earlier. Okay, so watch the intensity of this. And I don't know if you guys remember what happens when you scale a light. Like you guys before were probably scaling area lights to like soften or sharpen shadows. Because it was like that with Mental Ray and Maya. So this will do the same thing. If I scale the light, scale it up, it will blur the shadows. And that's what should happen. But watch what also happens. Take the light. I'm going to make it quite a bit bigger and wait for it. Look at the intensity of this thing. It is ridiculous, right? Way, way too bright. So the problem with this is because these lights are trying to act physically correct. When you make a light source brighter, it's supposed to make it more, like when you make it bigger, it's supposed to be more intense. Like that's just the way real lights work. But as an artist, doesn't that seem kind of like stupid? Because if you want to scale the light to soften a shadow, you don't want to be going back to intensity and then fixing that again just because you blurred a shadow. And that is really frustrating. So one thing I should have done earlier that I completely forgot to do is before you get too far with the light, like moving intensity around, is just click on it, go under Advanced, under the attributes. There's a normalized checkbox. This thing, if you turn it on, prevents the scale of the light from impacting intensity. And that is very, very helpful. So I'm going to hit it. Now, this render is probably going to get really dark as soon as I do this. And, oh yeah. So it got really dark. That doesn't mean it's broken. It's because most of the intensity from this wasn't because I put this in the right spot. It was that bright because I scaled the light up so big. But now because RenderBand knows the scale doesn't affect it, you're seeing like the true intensity, what we set it at with exposure, which clearly is not bright enough. So not a big deal. Just go here. Let's start bumping it up. Okay. Oh, I can barely see that. So we're starting to get something again. Okay. And you can tell, again, if I just kind of keep bumping it up, we're going to end up with something really, really similar to what we just had a second ago. So we'll maybe try 17 for this one. Okay, good enough. 17 seems fine for right now, I guess, or 17 and a half. But we're still getting a pretty good looking render. But now because we have done it with normalize turned on, if I were to go back to the light and let's say, myself or Shane or someone critiques you and says the shadows are too blurry, you want to scale the light down to sharpen them. But if I scale it down, you should notice that the shadows will get tighter, but the intensity is not going to change as much. It's a little more focused, but it's not like it's jumping erratically around. And obviously, if it's very, very small, it'll be a pretty tight little shadow. Yeah, there we go. So this is almost acting kind of like a flashlight at this point. So We'll scale it up again. I'll let you guys kind of play around with that. And feel free to like scale it one way. You don't have to do a uniform scale. Try going up, making it wider. That's something you guys will kind of figure out as you're working on it. Okay. I'm going to show you the tree shadow thing real fast, and then I'll probably move into the UV mapping just so we have enough time for that. So one really big thing here about the reference with the key light is this really cool tree branch and shadow effect that's casting across the scene. Now, normally if you guys were to try this like yourself on like a personal project, I think what a lot of people would do would think, all right, if I just model like a tree branch and kind of have it in front of the light, it would probably just kind of cast that shadow shape naturally into the scene. And there's nothing really wrong with doing it that way, but it does seem kind of like annoying. Like every time you want to have light from like a window kind of cast those cool patterns into the scene, like you don't want to model the entire outside environment just to get those effects. So what we have in RenderMan are these things called light filters, which is this button right here. And you can add a light filter to a selected light, and you can almost think of it kind of like I don't know if you know what a cookie or gobo or a gel is, like with actual stage lighting. You've probably seen it like if you've been to a concert where like the lights have these like colored lenses in front of them, or they might have like a weird cutout shape which kind of makes the light project into these patterns like stars on the stage, or it goes through like a blue gel and now the light looks like it's casting blue color across the stage in front of the the band. But that's basically what these are doing. So it's something connected to a light that controls what the light does when it passes through it without you modeling the actual tree. And these are really easy to use. The one we're going to be using is called the Pixar Cookie Light Filter. So all you got to do is you click on it, right click, Pixar Cookie Light Filter, and as long as your light is selected and you pick the right light, which we are, it's the key light, click it, and it's going to look a little weird. I think this might be trying to render it. Let me see. Oh yeah, it's trying to do it. Now you can tell probably even in this little kind of update here, see all the weird colors? Like that doesn't feel too good. So weird pinks, and why is it green there? It'll make sense in a second. So let me just kind of minimize. Actually, let me hit escape. Just gotta wait on this. Let's try to figure out what this is. So as soon as I did that, you can see this really weird like white square with like lines poking out of it going across the scene. Now if you go in the outliner, you see there's the original light, and you could rename it like key light. This guy is a different node. This is the filter. Now it does look weird, and you can see it's already using a texture called rat grid. But just click on the filter, hit W, and move it forward and watch what happens in the viewport. Move it in front of the light. See this little shape kind of popped? Let me back up. See how it's almost like you sort of like focusing a spotlight? And the distance that is from the light source determines how that light is going to fan out into the project. Now, putting it like this is kind of weird right now because I'm basically putting the filter way over here. So this is almost like saying I have light going through a window. Think of this like a window frame, like an open window. I have light going through a window way over here, which does not make any sense because that means the shelf is sticking out of the window outside, which is pretty stupid. But I have light going through a window, and you can actually see when light goes through the window, sort of the direction the light is going to fan out. So if the light was a lot closer to the window, it fans out wider, more distance, it focuses more in, kind of like a spotlight. Now, you really don't want to like move this off the scene like that, because you're going to start getting these weird issues. Like if the filter is positioned here, you're going to see a giant slice cutting through your frame, and right here on this side, it will start doing some weird texture and shadow effects, like whatever you end up deciding to do with this thing. So we definitely want to make sure it's closer to the light. Now, one other problem with this thing is Doing it this way, you really get some super blurry results because when this is set to physical cookie mode, it tries to act like a real shadow in a real window frame and light, meaning that the distance this is from the light source has a huge effect on how sharp the texture is going to be. That is not good. As an artist, I don't want to be fighting physics that much where I'm like battling both of these the whole time, just trying to get the damn shadow to work. So what I've kind of been recommending students do, and what we're doing for the first project, is don't worry about using physical for this one. Stick to analytic. Now, analytic isn't working physically correct, so it's not really going to behave like it should in the real world, but this is so much easier to use as an artist. Now, I don't really need this to kind of like scale through the whole thing. I can kind of rein that in a little bit, but what you want to do is set it to analytic, use the right texture. So this is in the documentation. So if you go over here, it'll tell you what you want. This is the Pixar cookie light filter. We want to use a treecookie.jpg, which is already in the source images. So we're just going to hit the folder. Okay, I'm in that project, source images, treecookie.jpg. There we go. Hit open. It's already on there. Now, I want to make sure that it's going to look right? Like, what is it doing? Let's try to render it. I'm going to do a new IPR. And let's load that up. And let's give it a second. This is what we had before with the old rat grid. And the rat grid was just like a weird, like a colored grid with like lines in it. Almost kind of like what you guys used before when you're doing UV mapping, like that weird red, green, blue checker pattern with a bunch of lines and numbers. That's kind of what this thing was supposed to look like. Now here's what we're getting with the new one. Now this does not look good, but it's because we haven't really moved it properly. But you can see we're getting these little like shadow effects cutting across. Very weird little slice right here. Let me see, what would that be? Oh, yeah, you can actually see where it is cutting through the geometry. So this will only project the pattern over what it intersects. So it's actually intersecting right there, and I think that is exactly where that line is forming. So this part of the wall is not receiving it. But it's connected to the light, but you can really move this around however you want. Don't think it needs to be sitting by the light source for it to work. This whole analytic setup, it's almost like you moving like just a piece of geometry. Take it, you could decide, I want to go over here. I mean, actually look at the reference. So I know that in the reference, the tree branch is predominantly on the left side, with just a little bit cutting to the right. We're clearly not getting that. So let's go over here, and I know that image. Let me actually show you what this looks like. Where is it? Okay, so this is the image we're using, and just kind of see how the tree is mostly on the left side. Also notice, by the way, how the tree is flipped upside down on top of itself on the top. Pretend you didn't see that. I just did that to help fill the shadows a little more. So there's now two trees connected, one's hanging upside down. But this whole little texture effect is mostly on the left side of the filter. This is all doing nothing. So when you look at the shape, the tree is right on this part. It's casting down that side of the shot. Now if I want that to appear on the wall, I probably want to take this guy, turn it, almost kind of like this, so it kind of feels like that left side is hitting there. And you can always like look through the camera, does that feel like it's somewhere over there? Maybe. You can't see the shadow in the viewport, unfortunately, so that's a little frustrating. But as long as you kind of, get it positioned, even anything close to that, watch your render. And once you see it move around in the render, you'll kind of get a pretty good idea, if you're doing it right. Like I'm getting a tree branch, like it's working. It's just a little tricky figuring out like which part of the tree am I looking at. And I think that guy right there actually might be that. Oh, I got unusually close by mistake. That was not supposed to happen. But I kind of got lucky with this thing a little bit, but you can like obviously scale it. This will make the tree branch bigger. You can kind of move it around to the right, to the left. You'll see it shift in the image tool, rotate it. You can tilt it down if you feel like it needs to aim kind of more on the top of the shelf. We'll just kind of let that go. So I don't know if I don't really have it in the right spot, but I think you guys kind of get the idea generally how it works. And just for your own sanity, because I know a lot of people lose their mind trying to get this in the right spot, when we grade this thing, we are not expecting you to get every single twig in the right spot. So we're not that picky, because this would be very difficult knowing which branch is which and trying to line it up. All I want you to do is, I mean, obviously try to get it as close as you can, but just compositionally, does it feel like the reference? Like, does it mainly have the bigger, thick trunk and branch over here? Does it overlap with the blade a little bit? And it might be kind of cool, too, if you're able to figure out how to get this other part that kind of overlaps into the right part of the frame, like where the bottle is. I don't have it yet, but even if you get it pretty close to that, and you blur it so it's close, you're going to be fine. We're not going to nitpick that one too much, because that is pretty difficult to line up in the perfect spot. But the only thing we're really missing with this thing is, it would take way too much tweaking. And we actually had a couple of campus students last month. Even when I told them they didn't have to like do that, they were like obsessed. They had like OCD issues. They're like, I must get every pixel to be the same. And they did get it really, really close. So I applaud them for losing 8 hours of their life that they're never getting back. Yeah. And that's totally fine. I mean, if you guys do that, I mean, obviously you're going to get a pretty damn good grade on it, but I just don't want you to feel like that's a requirement. Like, just do the best you can. But one kind of big thing about this, I didn't show you yet, is see how much sharper that one is? Like, this still has a little bit of a blur to it. So the only other thing you have to do, aside from putting it to analytic, picking the image, and obviously moving it in the right spot, is go down into blur. Like, don't do any of this stuff. Don't change the projection, multiplier. You can play around with that later at your own leisure. But the blur slider, move this up a little bit. So it's pretty touchy. Like, even going like halfway up will probably blur this thing a lot. Oh, you see how it's like, it's still there, but we've blurred it so much that it's basically been blurred completely out of the image. If I fade that back a little bit, we'll probably see it. Yeah, there. So this is 0.15, and even that's pretty fuzzy. So it doesn't take much to get it, pretty close. But even that's not too bad. But I think this is kind of cool because you can imagine like the possibilities. Like if you guys end up getting into like environment modeling or even like texture modeling, you just want to show some really cool dynamic shadows in the shot, add some like detail. This is so easy to set up. You can like make your own alphas for it like I did, just with like a black tree branch. And this thing uses color too. So if you did something like a cathedral and maybe you don't see the stained glass windows in the shot, but you still want the render to show those beautiful colored light effects kind of casting across the floor, you could load in a colored stained glass image in here, and if it's connected right, it will do exactly that. So it's super powerful, and there are a lot of ones we're not going to talk about, but if you kind of, again, go through the help docs, they'll break these down in a lot of detail. And I have another couple of videos on the project, like on the FSO activity, where this other artist does go into more detail with the other guys. But this is how we're using it for this class. It's pretty cool, though. I'll let you guys watch the lecture for the other parts. In the lecture recording, I go over the fill light, what the IES profile is, like what is the IES profile, which is this little pattern, how do you use it, and I'm going to talk about the dome light in the lecture. But those are easy. I'll just let you check that out after this. And eventually, when you're done, you're going to do a final render. Oh, I forgot to show you the crop. I do want to show you that real quick. So you know how before you could do like regional selections, like render part of the frame? You can still do that with RenderBand. As long as you have the image tools loaded, which is this little bar right here, hit the third button in, crop, and notice how my IPR is still running. So what you're supposed to do is you let the IPR run first. Then when it's doing its thing, click crop. Let's say you want to look at just the pulley and the shadow. You draw your marquee over it, which I'm just clicking and dragging. See how it's not updating? But you're going to hit the R button to render again. And as soon as you hit R on your keyboard, that tells RenderMan to update. This might take a second, because there we go. And now it's like focused on one area. Now, I don't know if it's going to matter a whole lot when you're doing the lighting this week, but I'm sure you can imagine like in week 3 and 4, when you're doing like individual materials, how much faster that would be to like focus on one object. So just the pulleys, bump, color, specularity, reflections. Then do just the glass, the metal, the books. So I use this quite a bit. And if you're ever done with the crop, I mean, you can scale it in. I could move it over here, hit R, update it on the handle. Like I'm done with the handle, great. Click, move it over here to the bottle, hit R, anytime, R. Come on, render, there we go. It'll update there. And if you're done, you can hit the little box, kill it. So I got rid of the crop. And if I hit R again without the crop, little bounding box around it, now when I hit R, it should update and do the full frame again. It's a little bit of a delay because of the recording, but that should do it. Anytime, you can totally restart. There we go. And now it's doing the full frame. And when you do your final shot, you're going to be using that button. But again, like I said earlier, make sure if you're going to use the render current frame for your final that you are looking through the camera when you hit the button. And then let it do its thing. Might take 7 minutes. When it's done, click on your render, which will be like a new line, file, export file, and then you save it out for the submission. But that is part 1. Okay. Do you guys have like any questions about any of the stuff I went over? I know we didn't talk about every single light, but I don't know if that kind of makes sense so far. All right, cool. So we're good there. I got about maybe 20, 30 minutes still. So let's just try to really hit on a few small things with that second part. Okay, this is part 1. Part 2 is UV mapping, everyone's favorite topic. I'm sure you guys are totally thrilled about this one. So you're not going to be UVing every model for this month. There's only 2 different objects we're UV mapping. We're going to be doing the scraper, which is in week 1, and then next week at the beginning, you're doing that guy right there, the pulley. All the other pieces though, like the bottle, the wall, books, shelf, they're all already done for you. So it's just those 2. So I don't want the whole class being you guys UVing stuff. That'd be terrible. Okay, so let's close out of all this. We're good. Or maybe when you're done, you will realize that you have never loved UV mapping as much as you have in VSD. And no one will ever say that. So let me show you how to UV this stuff. So on the scraper, it's pretty straightforward, but one really big thing about when you start this guy, so the scraper is a combined mesh. It's actually made up of a few different pieces, and I really would not recommend UVing the same one that you have in the lighting project. A couple reasons for that. One is if you separate it and you start moving things around so you can kind of get in there and see what's going on, you still have to put it back into the right spot. So there's a lot of user errors that can happen in that process. And on top of that, remember how when you guys are using the UV tools, how a lot of those things like cylindrical maps and planar maps, they want to use like orthographic angles to work, like a Y planar map, X planar map, Z. The scraper is already at a weird angle. So this means right out of the gate, before we even hit a single button, I know all these different mapping tools I'm going to use are probably going to start slowly breaking because they're trying to come from the side. It's a bad angle. Like everything is a bad angle. So how do we do this? we are going to, we're going to import in a different scraper object, like an OBJ file. We're going to UV that one. And then once we're done, we can transfer those UVs to this guy. So there's a tool in here I don't think you guys have probably seen yet under Mesh called Transfer Attributes. Have you ever used this thing? I don't know if this looks familiar. I can't imagine any class has shown you this, but this little tool here is used to copy data between similar objects. So we're using it to do a UV transfer, but you could use this to renumber vertices. So if you had like two meshes where the vertices didn't match, like the vertex numbers were different, you could transfer vertex numbers between them. That'll make more sense with rigging, which I don't think you guys have had character rigging yet, but they might talk about that a little bit. But we're just using it for UV transfers. Okay, yeah, maybe you did get it then. Either way, we're showing it again. So what I'm going to do is kind of ignore all this. We're going to do File, Import, or Command-I. We're going to back up, go into the main directory for the project. Okay, there is the OBJ folder. These are all the objects in the scene. Now, we don't need to bring them all in here. I just have these here as backup, just in case somehow you accidentally damage one of the objects. We had a student select and delete all the faces in the front of this top book. Like there's a giant hole looking into it. I have no clue how that happened. But if you do break one of the other objects, you can still bring it in and kind of line it up. But the only ones we're concerned about are this guy, scraper, and pulley. And for week 1, let's just bring in the scraper. Okay, there it is. At the origin, move it out. Now this guy is going to be perfect to UV because it's already laying flat with the grid. Excellent. So what we want to do is click on this guy. We're going to do Mesh, Separate. You can see as soon as I separate it, we're now broken into individual pieces. Got a little bit of history right there. We could delete history if we wanted. Let's move all these out. Okay, I'm not too concerned about the placement. I'm just basically moving things so I can get to all the pieces a little easier. So these are the different sections and chunks that make up the full object. Now, some of these are going to be really easy. Like everyone looks at the blade and thinks this is going to be a piece of cake. Like, yeah, I know we can do the blade. That's not really too difficult. But we want to use the new UV tool set. So in 2017, we're going to change our workspace to UV editing. Have you guys had a chance to already kind of use the different workspaces yet? I don't know if you've had a class show you how those work. They weren't in 16, but they're pretty sweet. If I can click on the damn line, that'd be good. Oh my God. Come on. There we go. Oh, geez. I just had it. So my one issue with this thing is the little line to move the window is so touchy. It's like a pixel width. Oh, my God. I'm going to lose my mind. There we go. Whew. There it is. Got it. Okay. Yes, this thing's pretty cool. It's way better than it was before, much more organized. So this is going to make your world a lot easier here. One small thing, though, if you guys are both new to the whole workspace concept in general, is you probably noticed how in some earlier versions of Maya, even in 16, they were slowly kind of transitioning into this kind of concept that like any panel can be pulled apart and like positioned into a new spot. Like you can, even by mistake, move windows around and snap it into the wrong spot. It's still possible to do that in Maya. So in the top right corner, under the UV editing workspace, which gives me the UV window, the perspective view, and some tools over here, if you accidentally move one of these tabs around and you want to get it back to the way it used to be, you could go over here and say reset current workspace. That will reset it back to the default, which is very helpful. You can also customize and save your own workspaces. So let's say you were back in Maya Classic and there's a bunch of like tools you like to use. Like you may use the modeling toolkit, but you also want the UV editor open. And then maybe you also want the outliner visible and the perspective. Like you could rearrange a bunch of different windows, go up here, save it as your own custom workspace, and every time you click on that one in the list, it will immediately rearrange all your panels to the exact configuration you want. So it's like the amount of control with this thing is kind of crazy. It just takes a little bit to get used to the concept of it. It's pretty slick. One small problem though, because a lot of people don't like the I can pull off any section and reattach it idea. They just want to like let things be. That button right there, which is so easy to miss, this is typically turned off when you guys first start Maya, or Maya 2017 or 18. Meaning, if I move like the hypershade or something in the wrong spot, I'll show you exactly what you guys have probably seen before. But watch this. Watch Maya when I start. Oh, see that? See how it's trying to dock it in the perspective view? Maya thinks every single window needs to be docked into another spot. Like, great, yes, I want to put the hypershade in the outliner. That does not make any sense. But Maya doesn't know that. So if you want to prevent it from constantly snapping crap into your viewer, hit the padlock that locks it, and now you don't have to fight with that ever again. So I have that turned on, and I only turn it off if I'm building a custom workspace. That's it. All right, so let's make sure we're back in UV editing. Just wanted to kind of throw that out there so you don't get annoyed with the whole new setup. Okay, so let's say we're clicking on the blade. Okay, so inside this new toolkit over here, we've got a bunch of tools and buttons at the top. Some of these you've used before. I'm just going to have it just that big. Okay, we've got the regular wireframe. This is shaded mode. This also shows you like the whole red, blue shells, if things are inverted, if they're backwards, if there's overlap. You all remember that. This is going to be UV distortion or texel density. This is kind of helpful if you have like a lot of pinching, if things are not unfolded the right way. It might help you see like in color, like red color, where things are bunched up too much. But we'll stick with just this one for now, regular wireframe. We have the texture borders. That's pretty helpful. Shell borders, which is very similar. And that's the grid. That doesn't matter. That's isolate selection. This is where we're doing the UV snapshot. So eventually when you're done, you're going to use this to save out your UV map. This is the checker. Now the checker is pretty cool because you don't have to make like a custom shader for it anymore. You just hit the checker button. And if you right click, it actually changed on me. Seriously? If I right click, it will kind of go to color mode, and then goes back to black and white. But this button right here will turn off the texture so it's visible in the model, but not in here. Because like, let's be honest, that is terrible. I can't see anything. Like, thank you. But having it on with this off is kind of nice, so at least I can kind of see what checker textures look like on the model, which is good for like identifying distortion and weird issues that maybe weren't visible, without it. All right, we'll come back to that. Now on the right side, these are going to be all the main tools you're using. Now they don't have everything. There are still going to be like a few tools that you probably need to find in here, just in case you don't see it in the list. Like one that you guys have used before that's not here is the smooth UV tool, like where they have the relax and there's an unfold slider. That's here. It's not over here. And the lattice, which I use this week, that's also here. And I don't think that is in this area. No, I don't think I see lattice. Yeah, so there are a few you'll find, but 95% of the stuff you need is all over here. So if I go under like transform, for example, so this is all of our basic transform tools, like changing pivots, moving things around. Like if I grabbed like the shell for this whole chunk right here and did that, you can see it's basically moving it at intervals of 0.1 across the grid. And if I type in like a full number here, it should move it one grid over. So these are good for like interval movements, if you were trying to move something around, very precise. And we have like rotation tools, scale, flipping stuff vertically, horizontally, all that fun stuff. Up here too, we have selections. So if I were to click on this and go through these buttons, you've got vertex, edge, face, so it's faces, UV. So you can see now I'm selecting UV components. And this is going to be the full shell. Now usually when I do it, I just right click and kind of do it this way. But if you like the buttons, you can always hit it there as well. Same thing. All right, I think you guys kind of get the general idea. Let's just dive in here and do something. So for the blade, let's do the easy guy. Okay, so we're gonna click on it, go to Object, there we go. We have this complete disaster of UVs. Looks terrible. What we want to start out with is, instead of fighting this thing and trying to like piece it back together, which is definitely what we do not want to do, we want to hit just a giant reset and start from scratch. So one really big thing about UV mapping is, how as you guys model a shape, Maya is kind of doing UVs in the background, and then you'll check out a gun or a sword you modeled. The UVs look terrible. So they were probably okay with like the first cube you started with, but just overdoing like extrudes and bevels and delete faces and all that stuff, it gets worse and worse. So we don't like this. Let's not fight with it. We're just going to take the whole object. We're going to go to Create. You'll see we have some different options here, things you recognize, planar maps, cylindrical maps. We're going to do a camera-based. Now the reason I'm doing that is because when I hit it, see how it looks just like what we're seeing in perspective? Meaning if I was above it, it looks like it's above it. Now the reason I'm doing that is not because I'm trying to get this perfect UV map. That's not the point. I'm doing this just so it resets it back into one shell. Because before, that piece was probably made up of about like a dozen different individual UV shells. There were cut edges. There were, things broken apart way too much. So now that it's been reset, because there are no cut edges anymore, I get to cut them myself, not just deal with whatever Maya happened to have there. Hey Candy, welcome to the meeting. The meeting is growing. We're just kind of talking about the second part to this week. I've been recording it the whole time, so I did a little introduction to RenderMan earlier. And if you want, you just check the recording when I post that thing, and you can watch all the, welcome to RenderMan tips and tricks and kind of how you start the first part to the activity. But I'm sort of into part 2 right now. So with this thing, I'm sure you guys looking at it, you probably already know exactly how you'd UV this. This looks like a giant planar map, right? Especially from Y coming from above. So I could do that, right? If I go to planar map, I could right click. Oops, sorry. If I shift left mouse button, see how it tells you different options? Shift left mouse brings up the options for it. Now you could pick Y axis. And I want to show you something here. So what you may want to do is, if you shift left click on it, bring up the options, see what this button right here, this little checkbox is doing in your Maya. Because I bet if you've never seen this, it's turned off. Watch what happens if I pick Y planar map with that off. Y meaning it's going to come from above. Look at the UVs, look at the mesh. You can tell it's close, but this looks kind of fat, right? Like, why is it so wide? And you'll notice how what Maya did is it took this shape and it's trying to scale it. See how it's trying to fit to the maximum boundaries of 0 to 1 space? That is a stupid idea, Maya. Like, it's good for certain situations, like if you're doing like just a plane and you want it to repeat and tile infinitely, almost like ground terrain in like a game engine where you just want that same dirt thing to go on forever and ever. That is where this is useful, because you would want the plane's UVs to go to the boundaries. That's how you make it tile. This is not supposed to tile. I just want it to look exactly like that. And the thing that's causing that problem is that one checkbox. So I usually keep this turned on. So when you have that enabled and you hit project, it's now the perfect size. Now, one thing that's kind of cool about this as well is you notice how like I did this by going into the options for it. Let me reset this again back to what we had before. So now look, if you put your mouse over it, read the little help tip again. Left mouse button is current, middle mouse is Y, right mouse is Z. Meaning if I just middle mouse button on this, regardless of what it was set to previously, middle mouse will do a Y planar map. Pretty cool. Now from here, like I think I got a pretty good little UV map. Let's check out our little shading. So just like before, you guys remember noticing like, okay, so things are kind of blue, but I also see purples and magentas and reds, and we know that's not really good. And it's doing that because we have both sides overlapping. Red, blue, we're getting a mix. So the solution here is we want to cut an edge to break those two parts away from each other. Now I can do that just by running a selection or like an edge loop around the blade. Really any of these edges are fine. So if I right click, go to edge, we'll maybe do this one, double click. You can see how it looks like it's wrapping around the whole model. Great. Now if I want to cut it, if I go to cut and sew, you'll see there's all the cut and sew options we had before. Cut will cut the edge. But because I'm trying to get a little bit better about using hotkeys and like the shortcuts, if I could hit this, but if you do shift right mouse button in the UV editor, see how all those tools that pop up are the same thing? And notice that what also is here. Unfold, that's a big one. But if I do cut, by shift right mouse button and pick it, it just cut the edges and I never have to worry about going into here. So maybe just practice that. It'll take a little bit getting used to, but I think that'll speed your workflow up a little bit. Now, if I cut the edge, what I should notice is that the top and bottom are separate. So how do we know if it worked? If we're in shell mode, okay, if you just click, try to move it, and if you see them split apart without any weird, pinching or they're not still connected, like these are clearly separate, it'll be pretty obvious if you did it right. But if you do cut all the right edges and they are done the right way, they should just simply separate without any hangups. Now I can kind of start fixing the problem. This guy is great. That one's red. That means it's inverted. So I can click on it. We can go to transform, scroll past all the little move and rotate stuff and go down. And look what we've got. Scale flip. I want to set to flip in U, which is horizontal. Hit the flip. Done. Now both pieces look pretty darn good. Let's go over here, go back to object mode. If I wanted to, I could turn shading back on, like our 5 key, and let's turn on the checker pattern. Looks pretty good, right? Look at the side right here. See that stretching? Sometimes you may not realize it's stretching, but if you click on a shell like this, okay, this is actually the top right here. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll move it, and I'll watch what the checkers are doing when I move it around. See the popping happening on the side? It's not really showing me any detail because that Y planar map I did is not accounting for that thin border that's going around the side of the blade. How do we fix it? This is where the unfold tool comes in, and I promise you the unfold tool will work. Because you guys have probably been burned by the unfold tool not doing what you want in previous classes. We've had so many people that will watch an instruction video or a tutorial online where it's like, this is the official unfold tool video. And of course the guy doing it will click it once and the whole object magically unfolds into the most beautiful UV map you've ever seen. And you do the exact same thing with the same model and yours collapses into a little twisted pretzel. And then you scream and you say, I hate UV mapping, I'm never doing this again. It still happens a little bit depending on how you cut your edges, but I promise you guys this is going to be so much smoother because they've done a lot of improvements to the math of how the unfold tool works. It is much smarter. Now this is granted a pretty easy effect. All I'm trying to get it to do is pop out a little border. I think unfold can handle that. So I'm going to click on the shell, unfold, done. Now mine's moving. You see how mine's kind of moving over a little bit. Not a huge deal, and it is a little bent here. I'm not too worried about that. Let me hold shift and left click. So if I go in the options, I want to say the moving thing is pack. Let me see. Yep. I gotta read up on what this guy is doing. Pack is what's causing it to move over. I don't. This might have something to do with like if you had multiple pieces selected. I think that tries to take every piece you have and almost try to like auto arrange it into 0 to 1 space at the same time. I don't really care for that, so I'll keep it off and do it that way. But even that little bend right there, that's really not a big deal. And if it really did bug you, I mean, just select the UVs and like do that. We're done. But that looks pretty good. And now if I move it, if I go back to UV mode here, when I move it, you can actually see the line going over the edge now. Before it was like doing that really weird pop. Now it is not. That looks great. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention earlier too is be careful when you're in like 1 or 3 mode, so that you know how that 3 key will subdivide the mesh into like a smoother object. You can do that, and I'll use 3 key to like spot check, because eventually this will be using the 3 key. But look how slow this is when I try to do anything with the 3 key. I don't know if it's gonna update. It's like, see how it's, I don't know if it's really showing you guys very much in the recording. This is like popping around really erratically. It's like, it's almost chugging, trying to keep up. That's the 3 key. Keep it in 1, it's smoother. So only use 3 to spot check, UV with the 1 mode. Yeah, it's totally not accurate. It's like, it's weird. But that's the blade. Easy, right? Now that's granted, that's probably one of the easiest part of the whole models. So I'm not too worried about that. This is where we really figure out how difficult or how well we know UV mapping. So let me right click, go to object, click on that guy. So again, like before, looks terrible, not a big deal. Let's kind of go into the create. I'm going to do a camera based, just again, do a reset, just to put it back into like one shell. Now, we have a couple ways we can do this. Shane Proctor, the studio artist, does a demo with the campus students where he kind of shows how to break this up with an automatic map. I want to show you that really quick, and I'll kind of let you guys play around with it and see if you like it. It is much faster doing it the way he shows it to the campus students. The only hang up is if you're not very comfortable with like navigating through the UV editor and like all the little shortcuts, it gets very tricky and you'll almost get frustrated trying to figure out how you get to the right menu again, because he's all into his like right clicking, like shift right click, and you know, going to the right menu over here. But I'll show you like what he was doing. He does this thing where he'll click on the model and just see what an automatic map does, like this. And you've probably done an automatic map before, and there's nothing really wrong with this. And you have to, if you do an automatic map, you really want to just analyze what the result is and just think through, is this going to be more work to fix this and piece it together? Or is it going to be easier to honestly not do it that way and just like individually planar map the parts and then put it back together that way? And that's something each student kind of has to figure out on their own. It's just a work preference. But what he does in his little thing is when you do an automatic map, it gives us a pretty good starting point. You'll see how there's all these weird jagged areas that are cutting out. So what he's going to do is he might grab some things like this. Let me grab like one of the sides. We'll kind of move some of this apart, like these guys. Okay, and he'll start figuring out where things connect. So for example, like if I was in edge mode, see how this edge is selecting that one right there? So he'll just like click on this, shift right click, move and sew. And move and sew, by the way, is also, I think it's that guy. Stitch together. I don't know why they renamed it. It's called move and sew when you shift right click, but I'm pretty sure it's the same thing as stitch together. We'll never know. But it kind of connected it. And you'll see how it immediately snaps those together. But because I have the border edges turned on, I can see where it didn't quite sew other edges. Not a big deal. Go to edge. I could start like marquee, and then I could do so. Go down here. Looks like a mess. Marquee. So. Oh, and I also have an edge going to a different part. And I'm using the G key. I think I have one. Oh, I have a gap right there. So this is trying to connect to some other piece over here somewhere. Let me do that again. So where is this? I'm hitting G to repeat the command. Okay, there's a part of that here. That is this section right there. So the way the automatic map worked is it broke that off into a completely separate small shell. Isn't that great? So we're going to move that over. But since I know this is that hole that's supposed to fill right there, I could kind of go over here, go to shell, right click, grab those edges, shift right click, move and sew, pops into place. And I think if I just marquee over these edges and do sew, see how they're starting to connect together? So we're going to go here, do the same thing, kind of marquee over that. I'm trying not to get a border, because if I click on one of those, it'll connect to another shell. Okay, now I'm sewing things together, and I think you guys kind of get the idea of what I'm doing right now. And it's not too bad, but see how like we're getting these overlapping issues that are slowly kind of occurring? So what he does is as he sews it together, when he notices pinching problems like this, he'll use something like the lasso tool. Under UV, he'll just select a cluster, not the whole shell. He likes to unfold in sections like this. Shift right click, unfold. And if he doesn't like it, he'll back up. G. So he almost does like regional cleanup with the unfold tool just to see if he can repair something. So this whole area right here is a little bit of a mess, and I think it's also because I have an edge that's still disconnected. Right, yeah, that guy. I think that might have been the one I was missing. Let me try this unfold again. That might have been it. Yeah, it's not too bad. Let me try doing the unfold on the whole thing and just see what happens. That's actually not too bad. Yeah, this worked a little better when I did the whole thing at once. It's kind of fixing some of this down here. And I know it's bending a little bit, but that still looks overall pretty clean. But he's essentially going through that process like piece by piece, and he's using a lot of like shortcuts like shift right clicking and like sewing edges and all that stuff. I just want you guys to see that, and if you want, you can give it a shot. But I also want to show you the backup plan that is more of the kind of tried and true way. It's a little slower, but it's probably easier for you because it's like kind of going back to the fundamentals. So let me back up. If we did the camera based right here, what most of you may want to do instead is just to physically cut and separate the pieces to do your individual planar maps. Now, one thing about doing it this way is, excuse me, I don't want you guys individually selecting faces to do a planar map. Because just think of how long that would take to select all the faces for the top. What you want to do instead is select your edges around the border. Over here, go to the front, run, whoops, not that guy, this one. Deselect those edges. So I'm just kind of running that border along the top. Okay, it looks good. Shift right click, cut. Let's go over here. It's not going to be completely separated because I want to have it cut here as well so it doesn't run through the whole model. Just to show you what I mean, if I was in shell mode, see how the whole thing's lighting up? It's because if I want that to be truly separate, I have to run a loop here. Shift right click, cut. Now that should be its own piece on the top. There it is. But when you do it this way, you kind of just get that one little flat chunk, which we all know looks like a planar map. Then I could go over here and do what we did earlier on the blade. Middle mouse button, planar, Y, done. And this one already looks pretty darn good. Now, if I do the same thing for the bottom, let's do that again. I'll do it a little bit faster. Okay, so just holding shift, running my edge loops, going over here, and then same thing. And just like before, I need to cut that guy right there. Cut, and we should have another piece. Okay, there it is right there. There's the bottom, middle mouse on planar. Okay, this one looks good. It's inverted. Go to transform, scroll down to flip and U, flip it. It looks blue. Fantastic. Now from here, I can kind of start working on the sides, like just get that one piece set up. So if I go in here, I'm going to go to edge, run a loop. Now this is a little tricky. Let me turn off that like shading thing real quick. See how the loop is running through the wrong spot? I want it to go around the border of the outside. So sometimes what you're going to do is you want to click on an edge, shift double click to kind of run the loop between the two components, cut, and then go in here and guide it around that cut. So I'm just kind of doing it in sections. Oh, I forgot to show you one thing. The texture button's turned on. See how it's not appearing in the viewport? They changed this in 17 for some reason. I think it was actually a mistake. But if you go into the display polygons, texture border edges, that'll turn it back on. And now they're always on, but now you can at least see them. I don't know why they did that, but I think they fixed it in 18. So if any of you guys are in Maya 2018, I believe that texture border thing will now turn on in the viewport again. I think someone messed that up. And I'm just kind of guiding it through this area. Okay. I know we're kind of getting closer to the end, so I'm going to try to wrap this up. So I'm just cutting it, basically guiding it around that part, and we're working our way up the side. And pretty soon we're going to be at the point where I can kind of do a separate map and then connect it to the other pieces. Okay, I think that worked. Here's the moment of truth. Did I do it right? I did. There it is. So I cut all the right edges. There's my piece. Now from here, I could get lucky. You know, maybe say, under planar map, if I shift left mouse button on it, there is an option for best plane. Like that's, let Maya pick, which I'm sure sounds terrifying. But sometimes Maya makes the right decision. Let's see what happens. Best plane. What do you got, Maya? Looks good to me. Now, even though Maya did a pretty good job, if I turn on the checker, because I do like to kind of spot check, is see how the checker looks like nice even squares here, but over the top it starts to stretch because it's curving. I mean, I kind of knew that was going to happen. But like we were seeing before, because this is a relatively simple shape, almost imagine like that being a curved piece of paper. I almost just want to like push down on it. Like if you imagine that curved piece sitting flat on the table, if you push down on it with your hand, it'll kind of flatten into a flat piece of paper. That's kind of what the Unfold tool is always trying to do. And I think this is easy enough of a shape where it can do that. So if I have that one side selected, go down to Unfold and hit the button, or again, shift right click and pick it here, looks pretty good. And if you look at the checkers, they're definitely way better. Now, the reason I'm kind of showing you this method too, as opposed to the other one, and they're both totally viable, is this way allows you to get each piece perfect individually, and then when you know each piece looks good, then you connect them. But you don't start with trying to connect multiple things together. So this guy right here probably goes to the side of that. Okay, you can see that's lighting up. Now, if I do a move and sew, let's just see what happens. Okay, move and sew. You can probably already see the problem. Little bit of a scale issue, right? Look at that. It's move and sew is move, rotate, and sew. It is not smart enough to scale the shell. So what you want to do if you see something weird like that happen, don't panic. All you got to do is, if I can get the thing to select, come on. There we go. Bring it over here and just line it up manually. Like rotate it, translate it, scale it up, and get it to the point where it looks like those things almost are a perfect fit before you ever hit the unfold or sew button. Like, see how much closer that is already just by lining them up? Like that. That looks pretty good. So let's try it. Click on this edge here. I'm going to shift click down to the bottom and double, whoop, wrong one. Let's try it again. There we go. Shift double click to connect that thing. Shift right click, move and sew. Bam, they're connected. Look how clean that is. And again, because I like to spot check with 3, click on the mesh, hit 3, and look how beautiful those checkers look. Rolls right off the side. It's perfect. And so you're basically doing a lot of that like through the whole handle. But that's the general idea, and you guys get to kind of pick which method you want. This one seems to be a little easier for most students because they're not too comfortable with all the shift right clicking menus quite yet. This is a little more, it's like Old Faithful. Like you just know if you do it this way and think about your primitive shapes and just block it out. Like where do I see a cylinder? Cut your edges, separate the shell, do a cylindrical map. Where do I see a flat plane? Cut the edges, do a Y-planar map, unfold it if you need to. It's sort of, that's the way UVing has always worked. But unfold is nice too. Let me show you what the final UV map is going to look like, and then we'll kind of close the GoToMeeting. We went the distance today. Oh, that's week 2. Wrong one. Not that guy. Here is the example. So this is, I'm just showing you what I ended up with. Do not think that this is the only way for you guys to get an A. Now there's a reason why I ended up with this map, because I'm thinking through like how to connect things together, reduce seams. I want to use up as much 0 to 1 space as possible, keep things organized. So mine looks like this, but we've had plenty of different variations that still get a 100 or a high A, and it does not look like mine. I just want you to see that so you kind of have like a target if you're feeling unsure and you maybe just want a little bit of help visualizing how you could arrange it. But these are like, that's the main handle, all connected, 2 blades, and a lot of this stuff is just like the miscellaneous little bolts and things that go with it. And some of these you can't even see anyway because they're like hidden on the inside. Okay, you guys have any questions about any of that stuff? We basically hit on both parts today. Yeah, I think it's one of those things where once you get in the project, you'll probably have little things pop up. Awesome. Cool. Well, I appreciate it, guys. Thanks for showing up. Pretty good little meeting here. And I will start uploading this to YouTube today. It's going to take a bit because it's like a 2-hour recording. But as soon as I get that thing converted and on my channel, I will send you all the video. Awesome. Cool. No problem, guys. I will probably talk to you all later in the week.